Between 1850 and 1900, something extraordinary happened across America. Thousands of cities, towns, and settlements had their names systematically changed. The official story: progress, modernization, a growing nation shedding its frontier past for something more refined. But what if the real reason was something far more deliberate? What if those original names pointed to a civilization that wasn't supposed to exist? A civilization called Tartaria that controlled North America long before the narrative you were taught in school. This isn't about conspiracy theories. This is about documented name changes that happen en masse during a 50-year window. And when you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Let's start with what we know for certain. In 1850, the United States had roughly 23 million people. By 1900, that number had exploded to 76 million. The narrative says this was the Great Westward Expansion, pioneers settling virgin territory, manifest destiny in action. But here's what doesn't add up. Those pioneers weren't naming cities after themselves or their hometowns back east. They were renaming cities that already had names, cities with infrastructure already in place, post offices, rail lines, grid systems that would take decades to build from scratch. Take San Francisco. In the 1840s, maps referred to it as Yerba Buena, Spanish for good herb, simple enough. But dig deeper and you find references to an even older name, one that appears on Russian and Chinese trade maps from the early 1800s, a name that translates roughly to the port of the Eastern Province. Eastern Province of what? Not Spain, not Mexico, something else. Or look at what happened in the Midwest. Between 1870 and 1890, over 300 towns in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio underwent official name changes. The pattern was always the same. The old name was foreign-sounding, Slavic, Turkish, sometimes just unpronounceable combinations of consonants that didn't fit English phonetics. The new name was always classical, Greek, Roman, or named after a founding father. Springfield, Athens, Columbus, Troy. The rebrand was deliberate and thorough. Official records from county clerks across the Midwest show petition after petition requesting name changes. But here's the strange part. The petitions don't come from residents. They come from railroad companies, from federal land offices, from surveying teams funded by the Army Corps of Engineers. These weren't grassroots movements by settlers wanting to honor their heritage. These were top-down directives to erase what came before. The Tartarian theory argues that a massive advanced civilization spanned the northern hemisphere until the mid-1800s. Architecture that defied the technological capabilities of the era. Massive World's Fair buildings constructed in months that official history claims took years. Star forts appearing on every continent with identical geometric precision. And yes, city names that didn't match the official settler narrative. What makes this particularly compelling is the sheer scale. We're not talking about a few isolated incidents. We're talking about systematic renaming across every major region. The Pacific Northwest, the Great Basin, the Mississippi Valley, even territories that wouldn't achieve statehood for decades. Someone was coordinating this effort at the federal level, and they were doing it while the country was supposedly consumed by westward expansion and civil war. Now let's talk about the maps. In 1850, the official US government map showed vast territories labelled as unexplored or Indian Territory. But Russian maps from the same year, they show cities, with populations, with trade routes, in places the American maps claim are wilderness. The discrepancy isn't small. We're talking about entire urban centres that exist on foreign maps but are completely absent from American records. The Smithsonian has archived correspondence from the 1860s between Army surveyors and Washington officials. The surveyors describe finding stone architecture of unknown origin and roadways that appear older than claimed settlement dates. The response from Washington was consistent. Reclassify. Rename. Do not include foreign names in official documentation. Take the case of what's now called Omaha, Nebraska. In 1854, when it was officially founded, it was described as a new settlement on the Missouri River. But French fur trappers had been trading there since the 1790s. Their journals reference a fortified city called Tonwatonga, a name that appears on Spanish maps from 1803, a name that suggests permanence, not a trading post, a city. By 1860, every reference to Tonwatonga had been systematically removed from federal records. Omaha was inserted retroactively into all previous documentation. The official explanation for this? Cultural sensitivity. The government wanted to move away from Native American names that might cause confusion or offense, except the names being erased weren't Native American. Linguistic analysis shows they don't match any known indigenous language family in North America. The phonetic structures are Turkic, Slavic, Persian, languages that had no business being in the American Midwest according to the accepted timeline. Then there's the architecture. Between 1850 and 1900, American cities underwent a building boom, massive neoclassical structures, government buildings that looked like they belonged in ancient Rome, libraries, courthouses, train stations with vaulted ceilings and intricate masonry. The official story is that these were built by American craftsmen using newly developed construction techniques, but photographs from the era tell a different story. These buildings didn't look new, they looked old, weathered stone, foundations that had clearly been there for decades, if not longer. The World's Fairs are where this gets really interesting. Chicago, 1893. The Columbian Exposition. Official history says 200 temporary buildings were constructed in 2 years to house the fair. Temporary, made of plaster and wood. Except photographs show stone, limestone, granite, buildings with the kind of detail work that takes master craftsmen years to complete. And when the fair ended, they demolished everything, every single building. The official reason? Fire hazard. The buildings were too fragile to maintain. Does that sound right to you? You spend millions building an architectural marvel and then burn it to the ground 6 months later. Here's what makes it even stranger. The labor force. Official records claim 12,000 workers built the entire White City in under 2 years. That's 200 buildings covering 600 acres. If you do the math, each worker would need to complete the equivalent of a 3-story building every 3 months. Not just framing. Complete stonework. Electrical systems, plumbing, interior finishing. The timeline doesn't work. What if those buildings weren't built for the fair? What if they were already there? What if the World's Fair was a cover story to explain why massive advanced architecture existed in a city that was supposedly founded less than 60 years earlier? And after the fair, what if the demolition was necessary to hide evidence of the true age and origin of those structures? This wasn't isolated to Chicago. St. Louis, 1904. Buffalo, 1901. San Francisco, 1915. Every major World's Fair followed the same pattern. Massive temporary buildings that looked permanent, incredible construction timelines that defied logic, and total demolition immediately after the event. No preservation, no museums, just rubble. Now back to the names. Why does this matter? Because names carry history. They carry origin stories. When you change a name, you change the narrative. You sever the connection to what came before. And when you do it systematically across an entire continent in a 50-year window, you're not modernizing. You're erasing. Consider what happened in California. In 1850, hundreds of towns had Spanish names. That makes sense given Mexico's control until 1848. But underneath the Spanish names were older names, names that showed up on Russian Orthodox mission records from the 1700s, names that matched Tatar naming conventions. California wasn't named after a Spanish queen. The etymology traces back to Khalifa, an Arabic word meaning successor or steward. Steward of what? A territory that extended far beyond what Spain ever controlled. Look at Sacramento now. The official founding date is 1848. Gold Rush boomtown era. But Spanish explorers mention a settlement called Sacu Mena in detailed expedition journals from 1808, 40 years before the supposed founding. The name appears on Russian naval charts from 1821, with population estimates, with notations about trade goods, with infrastructure descriptions. This wasn't a campsite, it was an established city. By 1850, every reference to Sacumena had been replaced with Sacramento. The pattern repeats across the Great Plains. Towns that official history claims were founded by settlers in the 1870s appear on French and Russian maps from the 1820s. With different names, with established populations, the Santa Fe Trail that supposedly opened up the southwest to American trade. Russian merchants were using that exact route 40 years earlier. They called it the Silk Road Extension, a trade route connecting the Pacific coast to the interior, not a frontier trail, established commercial highway. Then came the Civil War. From 1861 to 1865, the nation tore itself apart. Or that's the story. But during those same years, something else was happening. Entire cities were being rebuilt. Not repaired, rebuilt. Foundations replaced. Layouts altered. And when the war ended, the names had changed. This wasn't about North versus South. This was about consolidating control, about standardizing the historical narrative, about ensuring that anything that pointed to Tartarian origins was scrubbed from the record. The war provided perfect cover. Resources diverted, populations displaced, records destroyed in the chaos. And when the dust settled, new maps emerged. Maps that showed different city names, different founding dates, different origin stories. Take Atlanta. Sherman burned it in 1864. But photographs from 1866 show massive stone buildings that supposedly survived the fire. Buildings with architectural features that don't match anything else built in the South during that period. Buildings that look European, specifically Eastern European. The 1870s brought the Great Surveys. The federal government sent teams west to map the territories. Officially, this was about planning railroad routes and opening land for settlement. But the survey reports reveal something else. They describe finding ruins, stone structures, canal systems, agricultural terraces on a scale that suggested massive populations. None of this fit the virgin wilderness narrative. So it was documented, classified, and buried in archives that wouldn't be opened for another century. By 1890, the Census Bureau declared the frontier closed. There was no more unexplored territory. America stretched from coast to coast. One nation, under one history, except that history had been rewritten. The maps had been redrawn, the names had been changed, and anyone who remembered the old names was dying off. The generation that had lived through the transition was being replaced by a generation raised on the new narrative, a generation that believed America was 300 years old instead of thousands. The final piece is the photographs. In the 1850s, photography was new, rare, expensive. But by the 1890s, it was everywhere. And those photographs show something remarkable. They show cities that look old, not 50 years old, not 100 years old, ancient. Stone buildings with weathering patterns that take centuries to develop, infrastructure that doesn't match the settlement dates, populations that are too large too fast for the official growth rates. Look at photographs of Denver from 1870. According to official history, Denver was founded in 1858, 12 years before that photograph. But the buildings in that image aren't 12 years old. The brick has patina, the mortar has settled, the streets show wear patterns from decades of use. Either the official founding date is wrong, or those buildings were already there when the first American settlers arrived. The same pattern appears in Salt Lake City, in Cheyenne, in every major western city that claims to have been founded in the mid-1800s. The photographic evidence doesn't match the timeline. And when researchers started pointing this out, the response wasn't to investigate. It was to discredit, to mock, to label anyone questioning the narrative as a conspiracy theorist. But the photographs keep surfacing, in estate sales, in museum archives, in private collections, and they all tell the same story. Cities that look old when they're supposed to look new. Infrastructure that predates the settlement dates. Women in elaborate dresses, walking paved sidewalks past 3-story buildings in towns that supposedly didn't have 100 residents yet. But here's what they can't explain away. The documented name changes. The petition records in county archives. The railroad company memos explicitly ordering name standardization. The Army Corps of Engineers reports describing pre-existing infrastructure. The linguistic analysis showing non-English, non-Spanish, non-Indigenous names across territories that were supposedly empty. The architectural surveys documenting masonry techniques that didn't exist in America until the 1900s, being found in buildings supposedly constructed in the 1850s. This isn't about believing in a lost civilization. This is about acknowledging documented evidence that doesn't fit the accepted story. Evidence that suggests North America wasn't settled by European colonizers finding an empty continent. Evidence that points to a sophisticated pre-existing civilization that was deliberately written out of history during a 50-year window when the maps were redrawn and the names were changed. Between 1850 and 1900, America underwent the greatest historical revisionism campaign ever attempted. Thousands of cities renamed. Entire architectural legacies demolished, maps redrawn to erase what came before. And it worked. For over a century, the narrative held. But the evidence is still there, in county records, in archived maps, in photographs that don't match the timeline, in the names that were erased and the names that replaced them. The question isn't whether this happened. The records prove it did. The question is why. What was so threatening about those old names that they had to be systematically removed? What history were they trying to erase? And what does it mean that we've been living under that revised narrative ever since, without even knowing it?